Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We will start our discussion on a highly interesting topic. You made the right choice coming here. Our topic today is mobility, sustainable mobility and inclusive mobility. My name is Asina P. I am the Director of Sustainable Development at Société Générale, and I will introduce our panelists in a second. In my experience at Société Générale, we have been funding a lot of mobility solutions. And I worked on large-scale transport projects. And we've worked on sustainable mobility as well in the broader sense. And now we're trying to work on inclusive mobility as well. We are not dealing with mobility on its own and then sustainable mobility. This is a very broad topic, and this will be the topic of our debate today. There is a great deal to say when you are part of the OECD countries. There are a lot of ongoing discussions when it comes to the green transition. As we know, transport have a large carbon footprint. We need transports to be accessible, affordable, and this is also a large topic in emerging countries, for example, on the African continent, and we are being very active in Africa. And sometimes we feel that mobility is a topic of its own, but mobility deals with any other topics. It means access to education, it means allowing for people to work, to have access to food, and to be educated. Today you will have the opportunity to debate with us because we will have a Q&A session and we will talk about all the dimensions of mobility. I am delighted to introduce this morning our panelists. I will start with Joris Gaudion, and then I will give you some time to introduce yourself. Joris is the co-founder of La Ville E+, the City E+. We will also have Laure Coussira-Couster, the Deputy CEO of ADI, an association, and she will tell you what she does. We are also welcoming Stéphane Renier, the Head of Corporate Social Responsibility, or CSR, at ALD Automotive, our subsidiary. And finally, let me introduce Aurélie Davanès, one of the managers of ENEA Consulting, a company that is dealing with state-of-the-art mobility projects. And it's been working in Africa when it comes to sustainable mobility. So a great panel, as you can see. And I will now turn to my co-panelists to start this session. Ladies and gentlemen, sustainable mobility, as I said, has several dimensions. So I would like for you to all take the floor. Could you please tell us what your different companies do regarding this topic, and could you tell us how you address this multi-dimensional topic? Joris, you have the floor. Good morning. We are giving urban advice, and so we're interested in public policies because they help all stakeholders to take action in mobility. So for us, everything deals with policy. So we are trying to support public authorities at the local level most of the times to develop a public policy that will be operated locally, or we work with private investors, for example, or property companies that aim to make their projects part of a public policy or territorial policy, attractiveness policy. Thank you. That was very clear. Laure, you have the floor. Good morning, everyone. So I work in a totally different context. I am the representative of ADI, French association. It's been operating for 30 years, and it stands out for people to become entrepreneurs, and especially low-income people or people who do not have the right degree or the right career prospects. So we help them get funding, help those young entrepreneurs have access to loans, and we will support them to help them make their project a reality. So ADI is operating throughout France, and we have been developing funding support mechanism for precarious employees. Mobility is key, as Asina said. One entrepreneur out of 4 comes to see us to get funding for mobility. Because, of course, if you don't have access to vehicles, it makes entrepreneurs work harder. And for precarious workers, 100% of their requests are dealing with mobility because they often work at different unusual times. They work in rural areas. So, of course, mobility is key for these people to make their projects come true. 50% of our clients are precarious workers. Most of them live below the monetary poverty line. So giving access to mobility to all our clients is what we have been doing for 30 years, and we will see that later on. How can we make this mobility more inclusive, sustainable for people with a tight budget? Thank you very much, Laure. Stéphane, could you please tell us about your ALD solutions? Stéphane, good morning, everyone. Let me tell you about ALD Automotive first. We are both a large company, but an unknown company. So at 80%, we are a subsidiary of Société Générale. So my boss is here with me. And 20% is funded by Euronext Paris. When it comes to our legacy business model, we lease vehicles to companies. So a company to work needs leased vehicles instead of purchasing them. So we purchase cars for them and then lease them to the companies on a monthly basis. And this monthly basis takes into account the package with insurance, etc. And after a few years, we take the car back and sell it on the second-hand market. 1.7 million vehicles in the EU and throughout the world. So we are renting, leasing new vehicles to corporate clients. So we're trying to make sure those clients can pay for these. So why? You might be wondering why we are here debating with you this morning. Let me tell you 2 things. First, vehicles meet clear needs. The needs of people working, but using a vehicle to carry out their work on a daily basis. And secondly, vehicles are company cars, are used as company cars as well, mostly by managers to commute to work or for business trips as well. So there are needs. And the second reason why we are here is if you have a look at the vehicle fleet as a bath, the tap is on, so you want the water coming out of the tap to be as pure as possible. So that is what we do in the CSR department. We need to make sure that the water coming out of this tap into the tub is the most sustainable one. Thank you very much, Stéphane. Now, Aurélie, you have the floor. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aurélie Davernas, a manager of the Paris office at ENEA Consulting. So we are providing strategic advice to companies. Our characteristic is to focus on green and environment transition strategies of companies. So what's at stake for companies is not to offset their carbon footprint, but to overhaul their business model so that it is positive for the whole society at large. So we are working with companies trying to find new solutions for their business models to be as positive as possible for the environment and society. So we are working with stakeholders, human beings, but also the biodiversity. We focus on respecting all the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and that is why we are working on sustainable mobility. Why sustainable mobility? We often talk about mobility as having an environmental dimension, but at ENEA, we were convinced that mobility went beyond this sole dimension. So this was not enough. And in many regions in the world, development in mobility had to be environmental, but also inclusive from a societal point of view. So we launched two projects. First, a research project to understand funding solutions to invest in sustainable mobility, not to invest only in ecological mobility or not only investing in social development solely, but investing in both at the same time. So this was our first initiative, and a project was born, and it's called Energy Access Booster. We put in place solution competition for sub-Saharan entrepreneurs who had developed companies working on sustainable mobility, and we have handed out 3 different prizes to these entrepreneurs to help them, support them, develop their activity more in these countries. Thank you very much. You have noticed how complementary our panelists are. So we are talking about the different political aspects with Joris, and we have to be smart when drawing the lines of all the dimensions of this topic. People living in rural areas do not have the same issues as people living in the cities. So we have the ability to provide advice to those entrepreneurs. Stefan, what was interesting was your teaser. You said that the automotive industry went beyond sustainability and inclusivity, or beyond mobility for itself. So you are now including sustainability and inclusivity. And Law told us that by definition, ADI works on inclusive mobility, wishing that it also becomes sustainable. You might give us some examples, because the fear is that mobility can be inclusive but not sustainable. And ENEA with Aurélie tells us how you can provide advice on inclusion and sustainability when it comes to mobility in emerging countries. So thank you for introducing what you all do. As we said, sustainable inclusive mobility is a multi-impact topic. What do you think of that? Let's start with Law. You have given us a few clues already. Law. Yes, I said it already. Mobility is key for all precarious population, be it an entrepreneur or a company. If you're a small seller on the market, you will have to bring all your products and install them in the morning very early. If you are a plumber, you will have to go from one door to another. And if you're an employee with a low income, for example, a cleaning person that has to go to work at 5 or 6 in the morning to carry out their cleaning duties, they don't have access to public transport so early in the morning. So mobility is key to all the entrepreneurs we are supporting. And we have also noted that with 15,000 vehicles per year, we can have an impact. And we try to encourage our clients to be greener when using their vehicles. Most of our clients only have 3,000 euros to purchase a vehicle. So, of course, when we buy a vehicle that costs 3,900 euros, this is a high-polluting vehicle. So the impact we wish to have with our clients is to have an impact when supporting them and try to financially educate them. Most people only see 3,900 euros and how much it will cost them every month with the microcredit that they will have to take out. But in reality, behind this purchase, of course, there are insurance issues, maintenance issues, fuel cost issues. And by supporting them, our clients are more aware that by buying a more expensive vehicle, but that is greener, it won't cost them more. And this is of the utmost importance for us. And there are broader impacts that go beyond our operations. For example, having available vehicles, we are glad to see that the tap of water is running, because we will need this tap. Renewing our fleet is a question that we have right now. As you know, in the Paris region, by the 1st of January 2024, we will have to use a vehicle from the Criterium 1. That means replacing our fleet up to 68%. So you can imagine the volume of vehicles I'm talking about here. So we are looking at cleaner vehicles. We are looking at electric vehicles. It might be one solution, but not the only one. And then we need to have another impact in terms of infrastructure. When you live in a not so nice area, in a poor area, you do not have a charging station. So, of course, you could have an electric car, but if you cannot recharge it, we have an infrastructure issue. Asina, thank you very much. Before turning to Stefan, there are other associations like the Apprentices of Auteuil that are working with us, and they're trying to work on those issues. Many young people, for instance, if they do not have a driver's license, then we help them get one. And if they do not have the financial means to buy a car and live in a poor area, we will try to give them a training course whenever they can, because of course when they work late they cannot take public transport, or it's dangerous. So with the Apprentices of Auteuil, we are making electric scooters available. But of course there is the charging station issue. With inclusive mobility, the issue is to have a driver's license first, and then to have access to a car that we can use under the right conditions. What you said is highly interesting. You are working on inclusive mobility, but also on education, how to raise awareness regarding funding solutions so that they have access to more sustainable solutions. Stéphane, creating sustainable mobility at our scale, what does it mean? It means working on two complementary dimensions. First, increasing the electrical vehicle part that is part of our TAP, and secondly, working on other forms of mobility, less focus on vehicles. I mentioned electric vehicles first because this is quite a controversial topic. And of course, there are truths, but there are also untruths when it comes to their social and environmental impacts. First and foremost, electric vehicles also represent 3 zeros, not the exact same ones as the ones from this forum, but zero emission of nitrogen emission and zero emission of microparticles. And we know how much of a health issue that is. And third zero is zero noise. And this makes a huge difference, especially in large cities. So every time, of course, there's a disclaimer. So there are zero carbon emissions or nitrogen emissions when using it, because we have to take into account all the emissions throughout the production process of this car. So you have to take into account what comes first, because, of course, we need rare metals to produce electric batteries. And after several years, those batteries will need to be recycled. But all studies show it. When we take into account all this production and life cycle, electric vehicles are much better than combustion engine vehicles. And if we take the example of France, with a relatively low carbon electricity model that represents a reduction in pollution of 65 to 70%. And then there is the issue of exclusivity, because often there is the purchasing price that is much higher than its equivalent with a combustion engine. There is quite a gap, of course, to produce the battery. However, when you think in global cost of usage, this is what we said earlier. When we support our clients and when they take into account all global costs, so the usage, maintenance costs, energy costs for fuel or electricity, then we know that some countries, including France, electric vehicles are quite competitive and even less expensive than combustion engine vehicles. So we need to work on marketing this electric vehicle solution and support our clients in their transition process through charging stations where our clients work. Second part of this strategy, our alternative mobility offers. We've launched ALD Move in France. This initiative aims to defocus from usual vehicles, and we can offer mobility loans to our clients. So instead of having a company car throughout the year, an employee can have a mobility budget. And the employee will manage this budget using a payment card linked with an app, and they will be able to manage their mobility needs however they can. They can use taxis and other forms of mobility through a ticketing platform. So that is the tap. And then to conclude on this bathtub analogy, once the contracts are over, they enter the huge pool, a huge pool. And so the more we have, the more offers we have, there is a high societal impact in our sector. We will be one of the main drivers of relatively recent electric vehicles on the second-hand market. So they will be much more affordable, and we will give access to electric mobility to people who do not have access to it because they can't afford it. And this pool of second-hand, greener, cleaner vehicles will be part of a virtuous circle because, as my colleague said, we are launching a second-hand electric vehicle offer at preferential rates. Thank you very much, Stéphane.
Yes, thank you very much. We could have wondered why a company like yours would be working with people working in companies who need vehicles, either because they are commercial people or because they are managers. I'm sure you asked the question, what is the connection between LOR and ADI? This is an interesting connection. We've just heard this conversation and discussion. In our discussion, we heard that we are making vehicles, second-hand vehicles available, and as LOR was explaining, we explain to people, tell people that even with a limited budget, you may not have to buy a very polluting, highly polluting car, but we can also envisage a different type of model in order to have second-hand cars which are not very old, which are still very performant on a leasing basis, and therefore to switch from a mobility, inclusive mobility, to a much more sustainable mobility. That was really interesting. Another point which you mentioned, Stéphane, which I think is very interesting, when we talk about not looking simply at leasing vehicles, we're looking at sustainable mobility solutions. And what we're looking for here in this forum is that we're also looking at the impact. We should not be looking at owning a beautiful car. We need to come out of this kind of concept that makes people think that they have reached something because they have a nice car in a world that has so many constraints. What we do want now is simply to move from one point to another. This is the challenge, is to be able to move about, to go from place A to B, and for families, for households, what they do have is a larger car and then a smaller one that they'll be using most of the time, and the other one will be staying in the garage. So if we want to reduce the use of our resources, thinking of a mobility card when you can actually have the family car if you need to go on a long trip during a weekend, and then the electric vehicle for daily trips, and even maybe a bicycle or another vehicle, electric vehicle, then we really are reaching our point and what we are looking for, which is not so much owning but using a vehicle. We want to look at the real impact. This is true for mobility. This is true also for a number of other topics which we'll be addressing during this forum. We are looking at the impact, which is not necessarily owning a vehicle, or in some emerging countries, having a flagship hospital in the capital city is great, but what we're looking for is health, even in the territories at local level, which can be done in a different way than having a flagship hospital. And this can be true of universities and many other topics. Now I want to give you the floor, Joris. Yes, indeed, after my short introduction, indeed, these topics and the topic of mobility is a topic of a need for mobility, but also our relationship with time, with our metabolism of resources of 200 years. We have disconnected from the solar And we want to now continue to build, and we are in a very short time now. We have moved away from one type of metabolism. Now we are looking at increasing, basically first for a craftsperson, maybe. I was talking with a platform of handiwork that they were looking at having storage of equipment outside of Paris so that they can reach suburban areas much faster. Another area is the food sector. Some of the managers, or they don't have time to go to the city to get their supply. So we are looking at this angle of time, and that's when we are questioning this angle, that we're looking at more inclusive and more sustainable mobility. This is connected to space as well. We are in a territory or in cities with great flow, and this is when we are looking for ideas and finding ways, which is a way to coordinate the various initiatives, be it public or private initiatives. And we are seeing new concepts which we are familiar with now. These are multimodal concepts with various mobility offers from point A or to point B, and also the idea of intermodality to combine various ways of mobility. And we are now finding a number of key points in order to improve the system. For example, last spring I was working in the city of Creil. This is in the L'Oise department. In 30 minutes, you can be in Paris thanks to the train. People go to Creil station and they drive 15 kilometers, and you have all the poorer communities which are far from or close to the train station. So this is a multi-factor issue here. You have to join to get to the train station, either to work in the city of Creil or going to Paris to work in Paris, or simply to leave the poorest community to reach the train station. So all of these ways of transport could be done through different means of transport. When you want to improve the system and improve the impact, in Creil, for example, there are many unmet jobs. There are many jobs offers, so working on the mobility issue could have a huge social impact as well. Often we think of those who are moving, but we don't often talk about or think of those who do not have to travel. If I'm working in my workshop, for example, I'm working in my workplace all the time, and I don't necessarily need to have a car. So if we look at the various scales and levels, we could think at the various levels and dimensions. We could look at fuel for the company car, but also how to get to a place more easily or more quickly. There is a new study which has just qualified the transport between the house and workplace, in order to optimize in the Paris region mobility. For example, if your mobility experience is not very good between your workplace and your house, a lot of people then would stop going to work. People will either not show up at their workplace or they will lose their job. So we need to study this relationship between time and space, and we see how this can impact all the various ways and methods of transport, either for poorest populations or for privileged populations. The need for traveling for maybe a more precarious person at 5 a.m. and wondering how this person is going to go back home. So we need to look at all these points. This could become a different issue for a manager, for example. So we are looking at all of these points, aspects. We are looking at the relationship between time and space to improve the quality of transport, to look and think of the purpose of traveling, and to end up by not actually going anywhere. One of the best way to improve mobility is actually to not travel anywhere, which could take different forms indeed. For example, maybe grouping people in a workplace outside of the cities, in the suburban areas, or developing a food project. People do not want to go and look for food in lots of different places. So the idea would be to group a number of goods and products in specific places where it would be easier for people to get to. That gives you an idea of a better mobility and better access to workplaces and to resources. I like this idea of non-traveling, especially in this context of sustainable mobility. It's also a way of looking at how to improve our territories. So with soft mobility, how can I still continue with my activities, go shopping, go to work, or have access to public transport and all kinds of mobilities, be it sustainable or not. So indeed, in France, we have not conceived or designed territories along those lines. We had a certain idea of what it would be to be successful, or what would be considered as a success story. And some politicians mentioned it, that the idea would be to have a house, a villa that would not be in town but outside, that would be far from supermarkets, which have been developed everywhere. We developed our territories around cars and mobilities in the past. And at the end of the day, if you go to work, you use your car, then you pick up your kids at school with your car, you go shopping with your car, and then you end up doing a lot of driving. So if we do that, then we allow people then to have a non-sustainable mobility now, to go by foot. In Africa, people say that this is the first means of transport, is actually to walk to places. Good transition indeed, thank you. Indeed, this remained the best way of transport. 98% of people on Earth, actually, who do not have access to mobility are in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a region where the great majority of people are. We have mentioned the impact of mobility, especially in developed countries. Let's now talk about developing countries. Of course, these are similar issues. We have identified 4 main blocks of impact as to what mobility could achieve in developing countries. The first one, which is totally obvious and necessary, and we've been talking about this, which of course is the environmental issue. The issue of environment in developing countries is that the development has to be done in a decarbonized and clean way. As much as possible, has to be respectful of biodiversities, respectful of access to resources, etc. That's the first stake. The second stake, which we have mentioned and talked about with law, is that mobility allows an access to mobility development. Law mentioned access to employment for all the people who, thanks to mobility, will be able to actually go to places. But mobility, especially in developing countries and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is also a way to create employment and sustainable employment, and to release a lot of employment from classic type of employment. So we are looking at new initiatives. For example, someone transporting passengers on a highly polluting scooter in a sub-Saharan city in Africa. No one knows what they do. The scooter is highly polluting and can kill actually a lot of people because of road accidents. Once you invest and you are able to transform this into a company, you are able to invest in a good quality scooter, to invest in helmets for passengers, to invest in training, security training, etc. So the second stake there is really to structure the economic structure to develop sustainable employment. There's a third type of impact, which we have difficulties imagining, which is the security aspect. In developing countries, mobility is one of the main cause of death. And in sub-Saharan Africa, by 2030, fatalities due to transport and mobility would be as many as the virus if nothing has been done, because it's a lot of informal economy and there's a lot of foot traveling. So half of the fatalities are taking place in the developing countries, 93% actually. More than 80% of fatalities due to the atmosphere pollutions is also taking place in developing countries. These are incredible figures. There are a lot of challenges due to security, which of course are at the heart of non-OECD countries. And then a fourth impact, especially in France and in Europe, which of course is not necessarily thought of as much, but yet the risk is getting stronger, and that is women's inclusion of women, because mobility is a great driver for gender inclusion. Mobility that is not organized, that is not structured, is most of the time not accessible to women because it is highly dangerous. We worked on a project in Northern Africa in a place where women were not able to travel, not because there were no solutions for transport. There were solutions, but it was so dangerous in terms of sexual harassment, in terms of other issues. So it was just so dangerous for them. They could not simply travel to places. So we had to find other solutions, solutions that would be specific for women. For those who took the underground metro in Rio de Janeiro, you will see that there are special cards for women and children. So these are the four drivers. Of course, some are very close to what we already have in Europe, but there are specificities also which are for those countries, which are the issues of security. If we work on the mobility with a systemic approach, we can therefore avoid a number of fatalities and reduce a number of deaths on the roads, and also to make even the gender access to mobility. Thank you. That was really interesting. Now I would like us to move on and to talk in a much broader way, to talk about the levers, the drivers for success, for a greater sustainable mobility and more inclusive mobility. Who would like to take the floor? Who is more inspired? Maybe I can start and I can just share this testimony from the field. I can see two levers, two drivers, first with the public that we are helping, and another one from an institution point of view regarding our clients and public. You mentioned the transition which we all need to take regarding the ownership. Clearly, as today, we need to have access to clean mobility, but we need to change our model and to change the mindset and to change the approach of our clients. Owning a vehicle is not so much to look to anymore. Buying or purchasing a vehicle is very expensive now, so we need to look at the way we want to use our vehicles and how we can develop new solutions based on leasing solutions. I do no longer own my vehicles, but I'm going to rent it with a purchasing option. And this is a great difficulty, a great challenge for all of us, and this is true for the people that we work with, even though the car only cost 3,900 euros, for example, still we own these vehicles. So there is something really strong about owning a vehicle. So that's an important challenge that we are facing, and it is not easy to make this transition. Now, from an institution point of view, as has been said, one of the important driver is the partnership driver. In order to find mobility solutions, clean mobility solutions for people who are in precarious situations, we need to rely on partnerships. We need to have people who do own the vehicles that can lease them. We do not have a special fleet as of today, but we also need a financial engineering in order to carry those contracts, which are no longer, have become leasing contracts. So we have started this with ALD Automotive. We will launch a new offer in September in order to give access to our customers to some new long-term leasing systems or solutions. Vehicles which are now joining the second-hand market. These vehicles are less polluting and have very good quality criteria. And as part of our CSR commitment, we will now make these vehicles accessible to our customers with some discounts in order to help further our customers so that all can access these vehicles, which of course is another challenge. Stéphane, did you want to say something? Yes. I will make a difference between the various challenges and the drivers for success. The first circle is to do the job and to support our customers in this new sustainable emerging mobility in various geographies like Western Europe. And that's a challenge in itself in terms of supporting people and electrification. And we want to work with various actors in partnerships with actors who can bring some infrastructures, and that's already taking up a lot of our time. Just to give you an idea, we have about 30% of our new vehicles which are either purely electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. The second circle is to enlarge our field of action in these various geographies to new populations. For example, private customers, either just anyone or our customers, partners, or collaborators. I was talking about a product which we launched in France not so long ago in the ALD Move, which will be useful for our partners in order to manage short-term leasing so that the employers can make these vehicles available to their employees. And that's working exactly on the same basis as a leasing initiative. Another way to enlarge this circle is to go beyond the 3 or 4 years term, to extend the term. Imagine in the future, instead of having a vehicle, be it ICE vehicle or an EV vehicle, for 3 or 4 years, you could actually keep it for 8 to 10 years. And then the first contract would be to keep the vehicle and to use them again on the market for various purposes, be it short-term projects or carpooling. We know that carpooling also does not have a sustainable model with new vehicles. So all kinds of new models which will be profitable for vehicles that would be between 3 to 8 years old. And a third circle now is to actually enlarge this whole program on other geographies, which may not be as easy, even though nothing is really easy, even in Western Africa, and also to help our customers, be it in Kuala Lumpur, in Sao Paulo, in Casablanca, to move to an electric fleet. As you mentioned, the challenges, of course, are both environmental and health-wise. So these are the various challenges for us. Now, talking about drivers for success, we could talk about this for a long time, but this is a combination both of technology and human factors. Of course, we depend on progress in technologies, on batteries, etc., in order to extend the lifespan of the batteries, but also progress made in terms of charging times. But we also traditionally in Europe have too much focus on the technical aspect, and often we forget the human aspect. And our education, our pedagogy is also about helping our customers in managing the costs. It's an important aspect how to explain to an employer, to a collaborator who is 50 years old maybe, who's always been using a company car, just to explain to them that maybe in the future they should just give up this company car, the company car that the neighbors look to with envy, and that in the future they may not even have a car at all or have a different car, and to switch to a different mindset. And this is, of course, very profitable for the reduction of CO2 emission, but it takes a lot of pedagogy, a lot of reflection to talk with both the employer, with the employee, and with their surroundings. So that's a challenge, really. So we need to mix the technological input, which has progressed a great deal, with supporting measures to advise our customers. This is what we are doing, yes. There is hope with the next generation, the new generation, those who are under 50. I'm surprised to see how our children are renting Airbnb or going with a BlaBlaCar to places. Some of them have no desire even to take their driving license. For them, this is part of the past. So maybe this transition will also speed up with the way that the new generation would be using mobility. We'll see what happens when they turn 35 and they have 2 kids and so on, and they have to switch vehicles. That's another story, yes, indeed. But that's important. There's a change of usage, a change of mentality, a change of need. And I was really struck to see how we are all aware now. We've all read the reports of the IPCC. There's JCO, which is a group of scientists. They are looking at philosophy, anthropology, and different topics. And maybe some years ago, it may have not been considered as serious, but yet these are the two parts of the same medal or same coin. This group of people have really understood the importance of supporting people, helping to change their mindset. But first of all, to identify what are the barriers, the hindrances, because our brain, our mind has been educated, has been trained in a certain way. So we need to adapt to new schemes. And this is really interesting. So look at the works of the report of the GECO. Would you like to add something, Aurélie, on what has just been said on the various drivers, drivers for success? What do you think? Yes, there is one main driver, I would say, and Joris can add to what I'm saying. I'm sure he will have a lot to say. It's breaking silos. This is a real topic regarding mobility. We need to break silos. Often, the entities of the various bodies are very autonomous, and we can see that it is systemic and necessary by essence. One topic that needs to be speeding up, and that's very practical and very concrete in the short term, is to have less silos. Mobility is attracting 2 types of investors, 3 types of investors, actually. First of all, it attracts investors in infrastructures, investors who want to spend a lot of money in heavy infrastructures, mobility infrastructure like fast train, high-speed trains, or trucks, etc. That's one thing. Now it will attract another type of investors, green investors with environmental funds. Here we're talking about a lot of funds for decarbonized technologies, especially EV cars, but only and mainly that. And then you have a third type of investors on those topics which I mentioned earlier on, the multi-impact of mobility and mobility as a driver to depauperize population. So this is a different type of investors. There might be some among you here today. These are investors who want to invest in developing solutions. but we don't want to have the three investors investing at the same time. We need to have one. We need mobility solutions that would combine light and heavy transport, but also that would combine other solution with tickets from 5,000 euros to 1 billion euros. And we need various solutions which could be both inclusive, taking into account all these various populations, which some are far in remote areas who do not have, and they would need rather some green and non-polluting solutions. So we should be able to mix all those various investments in order to have really sustainable and inclusive solutions. And as of today, we still do not have the stakeholders that can look for various solutions for multi-impact.
This is the perfect segue for you, Joris. Joris, so as we said earlier, for mobility, we look at one another. So we are investing in our own systems, and we are working as individuals, individual players. But the good news is that is not the way to go. We need a system of different systems. So a system of several things working together. So I see two drivers. First, we need to negotiate new compromise. Let me give you a few examples. One tangible example in Évreux. We've worked on a Roman way used by farmers. It is 10 kilometers long, and it can connect 6 villages to Évreux. We had to negotiate a compromise between the width of a cycle lane and the standard width for tractors, to make sure that the dirty tires of the tractors do not mess up the cycle lane. So we had to negotiate with 51 different farmers. You can imagine how difficult this negotiation has been. But ultimately, the driver is for cyclists, farmers, all players. And there is another opportunity because there are joggers as well who want to jog on the tractor way and not on the cycle lane. Let me give you another example. In 2019, we work in Niamey. There were 1.2 million inhabitants, 600,000 in the city center and 600,000 in the outskirts, in the informal area, if you will. So we worked on the public transport system. There were 12 remaining buses operating, and thousands of private transporters were involved. So relaunching such a public transport system means investing in buses, reactivating lines, and then send people back to bus stations so that they can go further. So we had to overhaul this informal system, which meant a lot of investments. For buses, we can use RATP, so French public service buses, within the framework of cooperation contracts. We can also fund bus stops so that we can draw a real system. And we can also help craftsmen to gather, to unite. Let me give you the example of Madagascar. 100% of the public service transport is managed by private transporters. And one of the challenges is to increase the working condition of the driver, but also of the people using public transport, taking into account the change of the fleet that is needed. And let me finish with the example of Dakar. We have a 3-level system with a fast level with the rapid transit bus. And so we go from one large, fast infrastructure to buses infrastructure with a secondary system. And then there's a tertiary system that we need to draw with craftsmen, entrepreneurs, with sustainable models. And as you know, Africa is ahead of us in terms of active modes because of walking, but not in terms of cycling, and make sure that those active modes are less dangerous. And we need to make sure those systems take into account the existing secondary infrastructure, because certain of the ways that were already existing are now being blocked because of new infrastructures. So to conclude, to create sustainable inclusive mobility, we need to negotiate with the different players. We need a multi-level system, work depending on the needs of everyone, and not think in individual terms, but work in a cohesion with all the players at the scale of a community, a city, and a region. Hasina, thank you very much. You also mentioned non-mobility. So for the drivers, we need to overhaul our systems. Sometimes in certain villages, remote villages, it is too expensive to install new train lines. So there are other solutions, and I'm sure you all remember the ice cellar when you were a child. That was the best time for me. And you used to have in small villages bakers, butchers that would come to you. And it is also possible to have health services like this. So you can make an appointment and have access to the service when you need it. But in certain areas, you cannot have access to all the services exactly when you need them. So we need to rethink the mobility offer, and mobility can come to you in a way. We could talk about this for hours. I think we will stop here because we started a bit late. We have another 20 minutes. We were given 10 additional minutes. So before the Q&A session, I wanted to share something with you. One example that hit me, and I think it is an interesting example in terms of rethinking systems. I'm thinking of cable and telecable. We've recently funded in Madagascar a cable that goes above traffic. So you've all seen those cables in ski resorts, but in certain places it's quite expensive to create sidecars, tramways, and other public transport. So having this cable is noiseless, and it's easy to deploy and install those cables. So this is a non-invasive solution in Madagascar. This cable is above traffic. And what's even better is an example in Latin America, a cable in mountainous cities like Medellin in Colombia, with cable above this mountainous area. This makes the city more accessible. So by installing this cable, we create, not having this cable creates divisions between the different areas in a city. So installing this cable, which is something really easy to do on hills, enable people living at the top of a hill to go back down, have access to jobs, go further into other cities, thanks to an electronic and performing system, and still working. So there are various solutions to envisage, and the driver needs to be the impact we have. And for everything to go well. It doesn't mean selling an equipment. It's also thinking multi-modal solutions, rethinking the way people purchase vehicles, talking about impact as you have been doing, because thinking of the impact makes a project viable. So there are many solutions, but we need to think out of our comfort zone. And as mediators, we need to think of what matters most beyond just owning a vehicle. Except if you have concluding remarks, I think that we can now give the floor to you in the room. We're looking at you in a weird way because we have the lights in our eyes. Good morning. My name is Nafisa Gopil, founder of Sustainable Decision magazine. My hat off to you for all the sustainable and inclusive initiatives that you are carrying out. I have a question for Stéphane Régnier. I wrote down that 30% of your vehicles are electric vehicles within your fleet. Do you have goals for 2025? Do you wish to increase that number? And in the next 5 years, can we imagine that your whole fleet will be electric, just like the Post system fleet? And second question, you've mentioned a partnership with ADI. This sounds like a great initiative, supporting precarious workers. Would it be possible to know in concrete terms how much does it cost? Is it more interesting? Is it more worthwhile for clients because it is a partnership with Société Générale? And why not handing out an electric vehicle to those people? I wrote down that you only had 30% of electric vehicles within your fleet, but in the next 5 years, those people will have a greener means of transport, maybe. Thank you for your question. So the 30% I mentioned are not referring to our overall fleet, but only the deliveries in 1 year, so what we call the flow in banking terms. Our goal for 2025 was 30%. And we reached that goal 4 years ahead of time. So this is to show the momentum. So we are also working respecting regulation, and at the moment we are trying to think of reassessing our goals. We will, of course, set new goals in the next few months. It will be much more than 30%. We can imagine that by 2025, and without formally committing, I think that there will be many more electric vehicles, not 100%, because of course we are working in regions and with usages that are very diverse. So you can have a manager driving for 10 or 15 kilometers to commute, or we can have a salesman driving 30,000 kilometers per year on a highway, or a utilitarian vehicle being used all day long in Paris city centre. So there are different types of use. So of course we cannot have one-fits-all solution, but of course we are working along those lines. I will let my colleague give an example of our partnership with ADI. So why are we not providing electric vehicles to ADI clients? Because we do not have many yet. Since we are in a flow solution, we need need at least 3 to 5 years or 6 years for them to be profitable. So we now have significant volumes coming out of our fleet, but there aren't many yet. And they remain expensive compared to what ADI clients can afford in the short term. But what I mean here is that the more new electric vehicles we have now, the more second-hand electric vehicle we will have in the next 5 years. That will be put in the hands of ADI clients or other people. Law. I said it before. When it comes to the availability of second-hand electric vehicles, we have an issue with charging stations. In La Courneuve, for example, in the suburbs of Paris, there are no charging stations. So even though we could have access to second-hand electric vehicles, we would not have the charging stations, the needed infrastructure for those people to have access to them. When it comes to the benefits of our clients, within the partnership that we have with ALD, we need to make sure entrepreneurs have access to vehicles. ADI first assesses the request of our clients, and once it's done, ALD can have a vehicle available for this person. And within the context of this partnership, there is a financial bonus for our client so that the vehicle is less expensive than the man on the street buying a car. Stefan, what's interesting in this partnership is that for great companies that are used to thinking in terms of credit risks, working with precarious workers makes us aware that there can be internal blockages. Those people are not so much credit worthy. So working with a partner such as ADI, we managed to lift this obstacle. Question. Mrs. Coursera, what you said regarding charging stations is true. France is lagging behind, especially in Europe. But we are seeing the trend accelerating. So I am sure that there will be a charging station, or we hope so, that there will be more charging stations in the near future. Stefan, let me add something. There is a lot of momentum when it comes to charging stations, but let's bear in mind that 80% of charging stations for our clients are not part of the public space. They are part of the private space, so within a parking lot or at their house. So, of course, when we hear that there aren't enough charging stations in the street, but most of the time, or in certain cases, you do not need to have access to a charging station in the public space. And so we encourage our corporate clients to work on those existing charging stations already. Good morning. My name is Benoit. I come from the south of France. First, I would like to congratulate all your efforts. We are seeing that you're breaking silos, so my hat off to you. But I feel a bit frustrated because I haven't heard of the word bicycles, or just a few times. So I would I would like you, Joris, to tell me about cycling infrastructure in cities. I come from a small town. We are lagging behind in terms of cycling. How can we help those small cities in terms of security? You've mentioned it, and this is important. And when it comes to funding, when you're using an electric bicycle, you are not far from the 3,900 euro we heard. Joris. So, of course, there are several answers to your question, but of course, when traveling, people can use a bicycle, for instance. So, of course, it is possible for one area to have cycle lanes. That is the good news. The bad news is that in rural areas, you might have noticed it, on the side of the road, when people are driving at 70 to 90 kilometers per hour, cycling on the side of the road is quite dangerous. Or sometimes there are rainwater infrastructure, and you cannot have a cycle lane. So these are the challenges in rural areas. And these challenges are different from cities. So let me give you the example of rural areas first. So should we buy property alongside the road to install cycle lines, or should we work with shared lanes? You might have seen that. So on a small road, you can have 2 cycle lanes, and we can ask the car to be in the middle and to move away from the bicycles. So that is the low-cost solution to equip rural areas without buying property on the side of the road. But of course, this creates tensions with farmers because there is the non-treatment area. This is an area where farmers can no longer work. Secondly, bicycle is seen as an urban way of transport. So now in rural areas, we are seeing people using a bike. They bought houses at 250,000 euros and didn't think of their mobility. So of course, we need to make sure that bicycles are no longer seen as urban means of transport. In the urban areas, the challenge is to expand sidewalks so that passers-by can walk and convert part of this expanded sidewalk to have a cycle lane, but to have a continuous cycle lane. So we need to make decisions, have priorities, and what these RER Velo project is doing in the Paris region. So we need to focus our investments on major cycle lanes, and the Corona cycle lanes have helped because it showed that we could conquer one of the roads. I live in the suburbs of Paris, and it doesn't seem that there is more traffic, and now there is a cycle lane. And if you've and you might have noticed it, your garbage truck needs to be taken into account. I've seen it in a city. To install new cycle lanes, they worked hand in hand with a garbage truck to see where the trip that the garbage truck was taking, because there are many players to take into account. And once we have continuous cycle lanes, we can have cyclists. Laure. So for bicycles, we have interesting solutions. We are financially supporting our clients, but if we do not support them over time, it won't help them. So we have hundreds of people taking part in awareness-raising workshops to immediately think of bicycles whenever possible. So using a cargo bicycle and electric bicycles have helped. If you have a lot of equipment to transport, then it's better to have a cargo bike. And the volumes are the following: 15,000 financial support that we offer, and we only offer about hundreds electric bicycles. So this is a new trend, and this is something we can combine with entrepreneurial projects. Stéphane, when it comes to bicycles, we first have dedicated funding solutions. So first with a company electric bicycle offer. So we work with a startup called Asphalt. In our main producing countries, France and Belgium, we also have the opportunity to fund shared bicycle solutions managed by a company. So that is what we have in terms of dedicated funding solutions. I deeply believe in bicycles as one solution as part of a whole package, a whole mix of solutions. My next company car will be a smaller electric company car, of course, otherwise I can leave the room right now. So a smaller company car, but also an electric bicycle, and it will be part of the same package to encourage our employees to do the same and follow suit. And we'll try to encourage soft means of transport like bicycle. So the bicycle as one solution, as part of a mix of solutions, is what we're aiming for, because we think it is more meaningful to choose the means of transport that is best suited to you. Joris, if I may add something, I remember one night meeting delivery man, and he was in the suburban transport, and he was living further away in the Paris region. And so, of course, if we want people from more remote areas to have access to cities, we need to have great public transport infrastructure for those people to put their bikes on the train. And finally, when you have a heavier bicycle, like a long tail bicycle with you can carry your children with, we still have issues. You might have seen that certain areas are impossible to access with heavier bicycles. I often have to help people who are not as strong as me to go through those obstacles with their heavier bicycle. So sometimes we can have great solutions, but because we haven't thought the project through, we haven't taken into account all the players, then the solution is not great.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup.
Hello, thank you. Very interesting. One question quickly regarding what you have just said and seen so far regarding emerging developing countries when it comes to green mobility solutions from the AMFR Association. Okay, what have you seen so far? Okay, so the answer is not very different to what we have seen in non-emerging countries. Actually, on the other hand, emerging countries have two specificities Most of the time, these are economic models which are already overrating, because these are people who have been doing this for years already and who have implemented new ways of funding which are very simple. There was no fundraising initially to test a new economic model as such. Just to give you the example of the rickshaw, these are family investments and replacements which are done over several months. So the viability through existing solutions is already very present. What could be a challenge would be to scale up and to implement new solutions with a greater, larger impact. And this economic viability is a bit hindered by a few issues, or two main issues in emerging countries. In many of those countries, there are some public commitments regarding electric mobilities for infrastructures which are not yet in place. So the example of the United States is quite striking. It's very easy for an investor to invest 100 million euros with the mindset in North America, which is very open. There is no risks of credit, for example. In other countries, when there are no commitments or willingness to have charging stations in the long run, and in countries where we know that the political situation is unstable and that there might be coup d'etat and other political situations, it would be a lot more difficult for investors to invest on large-scale solutions. So in that case, the challenge will be to find solutions to take out the risks of the investments, and therefore to find solutions with stakeholders who will be able to invest a lot of money with some very patient and long-term return on investment. People will be willing to invest, but we would not be in a hurry to receive back their return on investment. We could also talk about the fact of coming out of this prism. For example, in African capital cities, we can start moving about with better ICE vehicles, which are of better quality, with less consumptions, with better maintenance, and with better social conditions for the drivers. So we should also look this at another possibility. There are many various ways and options. It's not just all black and white. We are working with CODATU, which is an association that works with emerging nations, and we are seeing intelligent solutions with ICE vehicle in order to move to this transition to meet the needs for traveling. This solution of inclusive mobility and sustainable mobility is not necessarily electric or hydrogen. It can also be with ICE vehicles. So we are looking at an organization of all the stakeholders in a much cleverer way. We are trying to optimize maybe parts. In Africa, the transport system can be unsettled by the various parts or by the lack of maintenance. So that's what we need to look at. This is what we need to improve and develop. We're looking at a way to help people to move about and to improve the relationship with time.
Merci beaucoup. Donc c'est une question pour.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Joris Gaudion now. The approach which you mentioned for co-building with stakeholders is great. As part of your activity, how do you do this? There are various geographies, there are various needs in emerging nations, but also in France, for example, connecting the rural areas with urban regions. There's a huge gap. Now, in your own activity, are you deploying half of your activities for France and half for the rest of the world? I'd be really sure to hear that. Actually, 100% of our time is spent in France on average territories with 20 to 50,000 people, either on larger cities or on average cities. We also work in Belgium mainly in Brussels and its region. We are involved in the renovation plan, public-private, but also working in other mid-sized cities like Charleroi. We are working on rehabilitating people living in cities. So we've worked on this idea of getting people to move back into the city. And also we are working in French-speaking Western Africa to help the various networks of investors to help with mobility, to make sure that the larger infrastructure would generate all this impact. So we are a key player in this, in the 3 geographies, in 3 regions where we have common threads and differences, but 100% of our time is actually to negotiate with stakeholders for local action. We are working in Creil, for example. Of course, the challenge and the stake would be different than in Marseille, which is another territory where we are working in. So every time this is very localized and it has to be addressed in a very contextual way. We are trying to have a sustainable impact, which is very interesting for investors, because investors will have the guarantee that the green investment will be sustainable. I think we will stop for now. We will stop on this statement of the sustainable impact. I want to thank you warmly for this very instructive and very good panel. Thank you for showing an interest in our discussion. Wishing you a good forum. I think we have great topics on key and fundamental issues. Thank you very much.